I'm super happy to be joined by this fantastic panel. As I'm introducing you, I'm going to unmute you. I'm going to go with Primavera first. Primavera, I had the pleasure to get to know you a little bit more deeply when you were in San Francisco last year, and I can't believe that it took us so long. But now I'm quite sad that the US, or at least like the Bay Area, has lost you for now. I'm hoping you're back very soon. But I think if you meet someone in a social setting and then afterwards look up their credentials, and I think sometimes I have this thing where I'm just flabbergasted by all the things that they have done, and I'm just like, wow, this is when have you ever had time to live? So I encourage you all to check out Primavera's I think published writing on a host of different topics. She's an incredible artist and has created really inspiring crypto art, but she has also published super extensively on anything from, I mean, you name it. I think in the crypto sector, if anyone has kind of like breached the whole schism, then I think it's you. So I'm really, really happy to have you here today. I just recently popped a few of your writings popped up again as I was like researching a few crypto coordination tools. I'm hoping we'll get to those today as well, but I'm happy that you're joining. Where are you right now, Primavera?
I'm in the countryside of France.
Oh, I think you may be muted. Or can others hear you?
Can you hear me?
Priyan, you can hear her?
We can hear her, yeah.
Wow, then I can't hear her. Okay. All right, please continue.
Well, I'm in the countryside of France. We escaped from the city with a few friends, and we're trying to survive in a very beautiful environment.
Okay, fantastic. You're switching back and forth on my AirPods, but it's really, really nice to see you again. Hopefully in person back soon. Thank you for joining. Next one up, we have Brian Behlendorf. I think, Brian, I met you at a Foresight panel maybe now 5 years ago on the future of blockchain technologies with Mark Miller that I moderated. And I think since then I've met you really at a few, like, not only social gatherings, but I think whenever there's anything that is kind of like more thinking about the next way in which we could be using currently emerging crypto commerce technologies. Whenever I'm in conversations like that, I can be sure that you're there as well. So I'm really happy to have you here. I'm going to unmute you now if you want to say a few words about your background and what you're excited about talking today.
Sure, and I think I actually attended my first Foresight event in 1998, yeah, met Christine Peterson around then. Christine Peterson actually convened a conversation of people involved in the open source community where the word open source was coined. So she deserves a lot of credit for that, and Foresight, I think, for thinking ahead, right, that this was going to be an important thing. So I've been in the open source space, doing lots of different things for 25, 30 years. I was one of the co-founders of Apache, started a couple of companies that tried to bring that kind of thinking and way of building software to the world. One was called CollabNet. Did a stint at the White House in the last administration, at the very beginning of it, trying to use open source software to move some policy things forward. Then a CTO at the World Economic Forum for a few years. And all of this was about trying to figure out how do we move the levers of government forward, move policy forward in important ways through the use of open technologies in one form or another. And for the last 4 years, I've been leading the Hyperledger initiative at the Linux Foundation, where we've been thinking really hard about how to use distributed ledger technology to further decentralize, further add trust, further add resiliency, further add censorship resistance to the core systems of the world, right? To the way people do business, to the way that people track information. How do you get us out of these kind of silos and single vendor kinds of traps? And so I think that's incredibly relevant today in the fight against COVID-19.
Nice. I like the explanation of single vendor traps. Primavera, do you want to fill us in maybe with a few words just to follow up on like what you're currently working on to give some context for the other panelists?
Yeah, I mean, actually, since COVID, I think my research, I thought I had a little bit of an existential crisis. I think I started questioning my research on blockchain governance. And actually, I finally find my new way, which is actually building upon the work that I've been doing on blockchain governance, which is really about trying to understand the extent to which the learnings and the failures and partial attempt at doing distributed governance in the blockchain space could actually teach something to the broader question of global governance. The whole question of like, how do we actually govern and manage polycentric systems? And actually, the COVID crisis is a very interesting example of how we do live in a completely interdependent world, and which have like all those clusters of power and decision making, and yet we do lack a global coordination mechanism. So most of my research since 2 months is actually going more into like the broader scale of global governance, and trying to see whether we can take some of the insights that we have been learning in blockchain governance and transpose them, or use some of this technology to support global governance mechanism.
Oh man, okay, it's a good pivot, and I'm hoping that we'll dive into that in just a second. I also want to welcome Jeff Laddish. Jeff is a Foresight Fellow since this year. We're quite humbled and happy to have him on board. I remember, I think when he applied to become a fellow, he was already applying in the biorisk, I think, in the biorisk category, and you know, who knew how you know, how pressing that would be this year. So I think that was a really, I think that was quite a timely application in that space. That being said, he has done covered a variety of different risk topics before. I think his slogan is applying the security mindset to everything. And so I'm really, really happy to have him here. He's been focused on contact tracing technologies and versions thereof really since COVID-19. And he's done a recent Foresight Salon, I think 2 weeks ago, I think with Tessa, another Foresight Fellow, on that topic, which we can share here. But Jeff, I think I muted you. If you want to say hi and you know what your relevance to this topic is, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, I think studying global catastrophic risk is an interesting thing because you sort of hope it's not not going to be relevant. And then here we are in a world where it is, of course. Yeah, so in the past, I've done a lot of different things. Information security is sort of my industry background. And then in terms of research, I've focused on biosecurity and nuclear security. When COVID-19 showed up, I was helping organize the Catalyst Biosecurity Conference in February. And that was sort of an interesting transition, sort of getting together the biosecurity community and watching this unfold. Sparked a lot of conversations, and sort of, you know, from those conversations, it became apparent that, you know, we'd need new tools to deal with this new crisis. And so I became involved in trying to figure out how we can scale up our testing capacities and our contact tracing capabilities. And I think it quickly became apparent that sort of we didn't have those tools built yet. And so I've been trying to help out various organizations wherever I can, make those tools possible, and also, you know, try to make sure that, you know, any technology we're creating in this space ends up doing more good than harm. So it's been really interesting to see this space evolve as Google and Apple enter the space, and as, you know, you have some private companies, nonprofits, all sorts of people trying to figure out how we can make that work. And yeah, it's been really interesting.
All right. Yeah, I think you touched on like different, I guess, like governance or like collaboration, kind of like levels between different actors in that space already in the last salon. So I'm happy to dive into that in a second. I think Peter is in Australia, so let's see if we can wake him up and get him to come. He was already prefacing like, okay, I will try. But Lou is on it. I think we can dive right in, you know, already.
I'm here, Allison.
Oh, you are here. Oh my God. Okay. Then you have a very different name. Peter, where are you?
I'm PDE.
You're PDE. Okay. Also, how did
partial differential equation?
Yeah, this is great. Okay, PDE. Okay, PDE. I'm really, really happy to have you here, man. I was definitely, yeah, I was definitely underestimating your ability to get up in the middle of the night and hop on a salon and talk about this incredibly complex and challenging topic. So we're super, super happy to have you here. Peter, like Jeff, also did a salon. I think now 3 or 4 weeks ago on contact tracing. When I mean, when it was really kind of like yeah, it wasn't even half baked yet at that point, and so it was a very early salon. It was really good how many people chimed in and shared different lists of currently ongoing contact tracing efforts. I think Peter has been really at the forefront of this development. He published, I think, really quite early stage. He published one document which is COVID Stop COVID Tech, which I'm going to share here in the chat. And then recently he's been contributing to another report that just came out from Harvard on a roadmap to pandemic resilience. So I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about that, but you were really, I think you really had the finger on the pulse there and have been thinking about this quite early on. Do you want to share anything about what you're currently working on that you're excited to talk about today?
Sure. Yes. So, I spent many years for background at as the Director of Technology Projects and Chief Computer Scientist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF. And so I'd spent many years thinking about how you can use cryptographic technologies to solve problems that use data about sometimes really intimate, sensitive data about people, like their location or other things about them, to solve needs that those individual people have collectively, or that a society has collectively, around health or transit or other things. And so we'd spent that time thinking about when you could use methods like differential privacy or federated learning or secure multi-party computation, or these obscure branches of cryptography, essentially, to meet say public health needs. And so COVID-19 contact tracing, or anonymous contact notification, as we've come to call it, is a pretty obvious place to apply that sort of technology. There are many more, but I also want to say, like, I think in some sense today I might play the role of the grumpy skeptic or non-techno optimist. And I can't tell if that's because it's 4 a.m. here in Australia and I overwork and I'm going to be like naturally grumpy, or in fact, I think perhaps more likely because I think I am unfortunately a little bit skeptical about how often and how far these methods can really help us to do coordination much better. I'm sort of more of an optimist that coordination is possible, but I think it's going to be often humans who have to find better ways of coordinating, and tech can at best help us a little bit. I'm really not a believer that there are lots of great technical ways to be more coordinated with the current kinds of technologies we have. But I'd love to be persuaded by my fellow panelists on that.
Well, I think you're already seeing a nod there from Brian, and I'm going to unmute all panelists now to kind of like launch into the first question, to just set the stage of like why are we even talking about contact tracing. So the first question, and I also asked it in the chat right now, is why do we need, why with the brackets do we need contact tracing, especially contact tracing technology? Let's just focus on that, and then which efforts are already going on around the world. So just to get people up to speed on like what are we even talking about? Does anyone want to tackle that?
Peter, I wonder if you want to mention the Harvard report here and sort of what their conclusions were, because I felt like that was a really good overview.
So the Roadmap for Resilience is this report that was put out by Danielle Allen and her colleagues at Harvard and a bunch of collaborators from a lot of different institutions, to try to help essentially implement this particular strategy that people have been talking about, different strategies for coming out of lockdown or dealing with COVID-19. And one of them in Australia, I think you could call this suppression. In the United States, it would be suppression at scale. Some people have called it like hammer and dance. It's like the dance part of that strategy. If you've locked down for a while and you've gone from being in a really terrible situation to a somewhat more under control situation, how do you come out of lockdown in a way that doesn't have really terrible consequences for the most vulnerable members of your society. And that group tried to articulate some of the things that really needed to be in place, including sufficient supply of testing. It's really an enormous number of tests that you need. Sufficient supply of contact tracing resources, which can include technology and apps that are built the right way. And Apple and Google's initiatives are really like giving us some optimism there, though we don't yet know whether the underlying Bluetooth technology will work, and we don't know whether the apps will get built well everywhere. We don't know if governments will adopt them everywhere. But human contact tracing, like the most obvious and important thing there is to do the version of this that we know is possible with humans. It would take, in the United States, hundreds of thousands of people, but that's actually a feature, not a bug. Contact tracer is a job you can do from home. We know we need to spend enormous amounts of stimulus money, so one of the obvious ways to spend it is to hire people to help track down and prevent COVID-19. Great. It's also a natural barrier to surveillance. If your tracing is being done by expensive humans, then you know that it's not going to continue way past the time that it's needed, or it's less likely to. But then the roadmap also grapples with the questions of vulnerability that apply to so many communities, and the fact that you can't just, you really need like many new forms of support to help people, especially vulnerable people, through the lockdown and through periods when societies may be reopening, but may really fundamentally not be safe for them to reopen with everyone around them.
All right, thanks. Does anyone want to fill in, especially about like what are kind of currently ongoing efforts? How are they going well, and what are problems associated with them?
I think kind of Jeffrey should go next since he's been looking at this so deeply.
Yeah, sure. So I think on the non-technical side, or on the human side of things, I think we've seen most countries that have big outbreaks have done something in the space of try to hire a bunch of contact tracers and try to train them. And I think we're seeing a big variability in terms of how effective these efforts have been. And one factor that we've seen is how much experience they have dealing with these kinds of things. In particular, do they have experience dealing with SARS or MERS? So I think we've sort of seen in general a pretty decent correlation between, do they have experience with these previous coronaviruses outbreaks, and sort of do they already know how to spin up contact tracing and testing efforts? And so there's definitely something to learn there in terms of sort of like institutional memory about how to do these things. I think I agree with Peter that these things don't have to be high tech, but I do think that technology, I think we've already seen technology play a big role, not from the sort of decentralized approaches, but honestly more from the centralized approaches, which is sort of an interesting case here because it's has a lot more privacy trade-offs. But I think we've seen with China, and we've seen with South Korea and Taiwan, one of the things that I think has helped their efforts is they have been collecting a massive amount of data. So I think South Korea has been an example that people have pointed to a lot, where they do use financial data, they do use GPS data, and they use sort of a broadcast SMS system to be able to reach lots of people at once. So I think it's data collection is one piece of it, and another piece is actually getting in contact with the people that you do need to reach. I think there's sort of two parts to that, and so I think that's sort of the early way that technology has played a role. And I think the sort of idea of having decentralized tools is something that has come sort of after the fact as a lot of countries are not comfortable with sort of having the government have access to all of these different data sources, and sort of wondering if there is a better way that would both accomplish some of the goals of being able to sort of reach lots of people, and sort of get that data to the right places, while sort of having less reach. And I think that this is where we're still in I think I wish we weren't in this world, but we're still in the very experimental phase where we don't actually know how well this will work, and we're still in the testing phase of like, can we roll out some Bluetooth-based apps that basically, you know, let's see, yeah, basically communicate with each other. So the basic way it works is that your phone will broadcast a big random number, and every 15 minutes it will change this number. And if you come in contact with anyone, your phones will basically be aware that they came in contact with each other based on this matching number. And if you or that person gets sick, you basically can go get tested, and your testing results will also maybe include a code or a QR code that you could put into your phone, into your app, and that will sort of authenticate you to share this with a database, and anyone who's come in contact with you can sort of see that they now have been potentially exposed. But anyone who hasn't come into contact with you sort of won't have access to any more information because they weren't with, you know, at any point next to you where you were sort of physically exchanging these numbers via Bluetooth. And so that's a sort of a decentralized approach that now has sort of Google and Apple support. Google and Apple are not building apps themselves, but they're building APIs that allow other app makers to sort of create those. And they're basically encouraging public health departments to go out and partner with technologists to build these things and make them available in their jurisdictions.
All right, thank you. I think, you know, if we already want to kind of like hop on to kind of like looking ahead, given that this, you know, salon is a little bit like more future setting, you know, Brian, do you maybe want to kind of take a stab at what are kind of like future coordination problems that beyond the pandemic that one may hope to solve with technologies that are either currently jumping up or like being kickstarted, or that have already been at our disposal, but we just now have a really good excuse to use them. And Primavera, I would love to hear from you on that too.
Well, I think there's actually some application of of this technology that very much feeds into the contact tracing use case. And I'll say I haven't been as immersed in this as Peter and Jeffrey have been, but the Safra Center paper, Peter, is excellent. And Dakota Groiner, who also contributed it, she runs something called ID 2020, which for the last few years has been looking at the application of digital identity and credentials, whether around immunization or other purposes in the developing world, and trying to figure out what is the right privacy preserving and effective tooling for digital identity at nationwide scale, but in a way that doesn't create these kind of surveillance nightmares or these kind of bad digital ID systems like you see in India with the Aadhaar system. And that has suddenly become a lot more relevant. And a key part to doing this in a privacy preserving way and in a way that doesn't create these real points of control and power is through an emerging kind of terminology called user-centric or self-sovereign digital identity. And this is the notion that instead of your identity being defined by what's parked in a server in Mountain View, or metaphorically speaking, around the world, and owned by a small set of entities. Instead, your identity is comprised of information about you attested to by other people in the form of certificates, credentials, that sort of thing, that you store in a wallet, or you store in something familiar like that in the user kind of paradigm, but then present those when you want to get access to something, or you need to prove your identity for something, and in a way that doesn't create this backlink to the issuer of the credential that creates these surveillance nightmares. And essential in these kinds of deployments is either a very, very highly federated approach to verifying the integrities of the integrity of these credentials, or in a completely decentralized way using blockchain technology. In fact, the largest at-scale deployment now of self-sovereign ID is using blockchain technologies. Things like in the government of British Columbia in Canada has a business registration system that they've launched using Hyperledger Indy and a bunch of of other related technologies to essentially give business owners credentials they can present in this way. And we're seeing that serve as the basis for Kiva's project in Sierra Leone, around where they're reinventing credit histories using distributed self-sovereign ID. Lots and lots of other interesting projects lighting up on this front. And so what's the relevancy of that to contact tracing, and as well as to this kind of adjacent thing that has come up over and over, which is around immunity passports, which is a horrible term, but immunity credentials, basically taking the little yellow book you had of immunizations that you used to need to be able to travel to a whole lot of countries to prove that you've had immunizations against certain diseases, vaccinations against those diseases. We are likely going to see a need for those kinds of credentials emerge in perhaps other forms of travel between countries, perhaps even within countries, perhaps being able to go back to work in certain health sensitive fields. There's a lot of a huge ethical and moral issues involved with this, of course. And as a board member of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, you often have to think about what are these red lines that or lines in the sand that you want to establish, like we did with cryptography systems, right? No backdoors in cryptography systems was a hard line that we all adopted as an industry. And he said, we're not going to even entertain safe ways to do that. On immunity credentials, there is this big question of, is that something that's worth doing or not? If we have to do it, if we have to do, and do automated means of contact tracing that create these risks, that there'll be systems that stay up long after the pandemic has passed. If the consensus of society is that that's the path we're going to head in, then it's kind of incumbent upon us as technologists and moral actors, I argue, to find a harm reduction approach to it, a risk mitigation approach that says, all right, if you have to go down these paths, if the moral calculus, the ethical calculus says that this is worth doing, let's find approaches that do it with a maximum degree of privacy preservation and decentralization. And so that's where I've been really encouraged by what's going on in the self-sovereign ID space. And I think that is an appropriate path that was worked into the Software Center's report. So it was good to see. And with contact tracing, there's a bit less of a blockchain association with that, mainly because the exercise of public health is very much a top-down thing. But when it comes to actually being able to prove to a contact tracer, a human, hey, I've already passed an antibodies test, or I've passed I'm sick and now I'm not sick kind of test, or I've received a vaccination. Once we get to that point, then you should be able to not have to quarantine for 14 days. And taking people's word for it might scale up to a certain degree, but using digital credentials, I think, is what's going to be necessary to do this at a society-wide scale.
Thank you. Okay, that was quite the list there. Thanks so much. Primavera, given the fact that you've already mentioned in your introduction, you had the little existential moment, and then, kind of like pivoted and thinking more broad scale about what can those technologies do for coordination? Do you want to kind of like tackle that in a more future shadowing way? Like which kind of like future looking coordination problems do you think we may be able to solve, via the technologies that you guys are working on, and which may be, out of the realm?
Yeah, I think I just want to separate just very shortly like the distinction. I think contact tracing is a very specific problem, and I'm not sure the extent to which contact tracing really relates either with blockchain or how the way in which contact tracing is being implemented at the moment could help in coordination. I think that at least in Europe we still have quite a big debate about the implementation of we have like a consortium that has kind of like designed some kind of standard protocol for contact tracing, and it turns out that it's actually quite centralized, even though it's based on Bluetooth and it's based on crypto identifiers. But in the end, you have a central server that is assigning those identifier and then collecting all the other identifiers that were in nearby, so that in some way, like they cannot necessarily, they don't have the identity of the people, but they can know all the social graph of the people that were actually infected, and potentially triangulating the information to get the information. So basically, like we have like, well, we had this big consortium, PET-PT, that a lot of actors have eventually decided to leave, and now there is like a big debate about like how little privacy compliant it is. And then there is like a new protocol, DP3T, which actually to some extent provide a similar solution, but still with a centralized server, but without giving any information to the centralized server that could actually let them get any knowledge about the social graph of the user, because the identifiers are generated directly by the user. So in that sense, I think it kind of connects a little bit to the notion of self-sovereign identity, but basically the idea is that it's absolutely fundamental when we're thinking about designing these type of applications, that the identification or the identifiers is necessarily and always generated by the user, and the user then decide to communicate some information, but then all the processing and the analysis of the extent to which someone is at risk happens at the level of the user as opposed to at the level of the server. So I think this is just it doesn't have much to do with blockchain, but I think it's just like a general design. And the contact tracing debate is actually bringing this to the surface, and I think it's actually a very fascinating debate. So of course there is like the technological design, and then there is like so many. So I fully agree with Peter, which is it's great to question like to which extent do we need a privacy compliant application, to which extent actually having a centralized server could provide better public health benefit and so forth. But then there is like the very core question, I think, and that's where it comes more into governance, is to which extent will the app be adopted? Because in the end, like people need to actually install this app, they need to bring their phone with them at any point in time and so forth. So there needs to be some level of trust in the institutions that are managing the app. And that's actually a big problem. And I think many people will actually don't, in spite of wanting to help reduce the spread of the disease, if they don't trust and if they don't feel that there is sufficient privacy, they will not install the app. And the other question, which I think is even more problematic, is the question of compliance with the quarantine. Meaning that if I realize I'm flagged, to which extent I'm actually gonna stop going to work, can I actually afford not going to work, if there is no institutions, if there is no proper like work insurance, if there is no some system of social welfare and healthcare, etc. So to me, like the problem of like the contact tracing app is, it's not just like, it's very difficult to look at it just from like this technological design question, and the actual governance of the data is fundamental, but then also the institutional framework that goes around it becomes absolutely fundamental. So that's not really like, that has nothing to do with blockchain as such. But I think it's really about like how do we actually get systems that give back to the people their sovereignty, so that by how you design the app, you will actually also give a choice to the people to install it because they trust the system, but also I want to be sure that when I get flagged, I also get to choose the extent to which I can disclose the fact that I'm flagged, and then choose how to react, whether I want to completely isolate myself, whether I want to be more careful and so forth. But by designing it in a centralized system, I think we're destroying the trust that people have in the system, and we actually lose the self-discipline that becomes actually so important in these periods.
Yeah, thank you. I think we just had a little debate on like whether contact tracing at all or not in the chat, and I think one participant said it's okay if voluntary and anonymous, which I think is not how at least a few governments are currently practicing it. But I think as I think I want to stop at 45 to take participant questions, but like maybe going back to Peter's point earlier about like the grumpiness about, well, can we even can technology even help us coordinate in those? And I know I'm butchering this, but do you maybe want to like kind of like take a stab at that? Which coordination problems do you actually think could be solved by technologies, and where do we actually need people? And if so, are there specific good projects out there already that are making headway, not only on the pandemic, but also on other kind of global coordination problems that we care about?
Well, before I talk about the bigger question, there was a question about contact tracing in the channel I thought was really interesting, which is like, where does this go wrong? Like, what's the dystopian version of like of how this technology or how this practice winds up hurting people? And I think the widely understood answer is with respect to HIV and AIDS, where contact tracing is essential for containing the HIV pandemic. It really like saves an enormous number of lives, but it also has been like, especially historically, was a huge intrusion on the queer communities in the West, where contact tracing was being done, and the pandemic was noticed for the first time. Of course, it had been around in Africa for most of a century beforehand and not noticed or understood. But because contact tracing wasn't always done with sufficient anonymization or sensitivity to the people involved, you had lots of people essentially being outed by the contact tracing process, or having like really intimate details of their lives exposed, or having their relationships with other people subject to scrutiny as a result of a potential HIV transmission, and that really drove a wedge between public health authorities and the gay community in a lot of places, until people started to think more carefully about what kinds of privacy you could provide, and what kinds of anonymity you could provide during these processes. But to pick your larger question back up, how can technology help? I mean, I think there are a lot of obvious ways, or maybe no longer obvious because they're kind of the water we swim in. But like, we're on this Zoom call, or like on video calls, whether it's Zoom or something else, for so many hours of the day. We're all communicating with Slack and email and social media, and that is a hugely useful coordinating technology. I think the fact that, for me, the fact that humanity locked down in response to COVID-19 was the sign that we have a new global immune system that we didn't have beforehand. Humanity's never responded in a globally coordinated way to a crisis before, ever. And I think a lot of people will debate whether the response that we made to COVID-19 was the right one, for a whole lot of complicated reasons. But the fact that we had a response at all is kind of amazing. And I've been doing some wondering about like, how did this happen? Because epidemiologists, at least some who I've been sheltering with and talking to, say there was no part of our pandemic planning. Australia had a pandemic preparedness plan. No part of it was locking down, because they didn't think it was possible. They didn't think there was any way in which society as a whole could or would stop going outside for months at a time. And so they hadn't included that in their planning. And then I guess it was exhibited by China and a number of other Asian governments as a response, and shown to have some effectiveness. But simultaneously, I think an enormous number of people around the world were reading the scientific literature about COVID-19 as the epidemic grew, and talking to each other on social media about how bad it was. I know in the Bay Area, we had a big grassroots push essentially for things that looked quite a lot like lockdown, coming from social media. And then, you know, when London Breed got up on YouTube or whatever, got up on the internet and announced that it was happening, I think lots of us were like, oh, thank God, like, you know, we're in a place where our government has been paying some attention. And so I think the ways in which technology will like really help with coordination will only rarely be very specific new protocols and tech that do something fancy. Sometimes something like the GP3T or TCM protocols, which have now become the Apple and Google protocol, you know, will solve an amazingly hard coordination problem that we couldn't solve well beforehand. But I think more often it'll be just the obvious rising tide of we're using the internet more, and that gives us ways as a planet to be coordinated in our response to things. Also, it gives us a whole host of crazy new failure modes that I don't think we understand very well yet.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Primavera, you also had an answer to this. And then Erin, I'm unmuting you for your question.
Yeah, I will finally bring back the blockchain to the table. To me, like, I have at least two answers in like how technology can actually help in coordination. I think one is actually by increasing confidence in institutions, in the sense that I think, like, especially in a period of crisis, it's extremely important that we get to trust the institution that we are interacting with. And at the moment, whether those are like public or private companies, it's we kind of have lost this level of trust. Like, it's kind of ridiculous in some way, or ironic, that Google and Apple are actually providing a privacy solution to these pandemics after like all the privacy intrusions that they do. So to me, like, there is like a very interesting way to use blockchain technology to actually incorporate specific technological guarantees into the ongoing operation and routine of those specific institutions of operators, so that whether it's because there is more transparency, because there is more auditability, because of deterministic computation, because of like all the specific guarantees that blockchain technology can provide, then by increasing the confidence in the way in which they work, then we need to trust them much less, because there is more predictability and verifiability about the way they operate, and therefore we might be more willing to actually engage into that layer of trust that we still need to do. So that's one thing. The other thing is in terms of more like general decentralized coordination. You know, in like the literature of like polycentricity and Ostrom and all this stuff, there is like this difficulty of actually achieving decentralized yet coordinated action in a context in which there is no proper monitoring or enforcement. And usually monitoring and enforcement require some kind of centralized entity. And in this sense, I think blockchain technology is also very interesting because it provides those two solutions of monitoring through these global and decentralized but verifiable database, so people can actually record information and that becomes some form of monitoring. And then enforcement by binding ourselves through this deterministic computation to actually act in a particular manner, in a sense that instead of having ex post enforcement, we can have ex ante automatic executions. And so in that sense, it becomes very interesting because blockchain technology, if properly deployed, could actually help achieve what Ostrom is trying to theorize in the context of like having this polycentric system in which, without the need of creating an overarching dominant superpower, we can actually coordinate ourselves in a decentralized manner.
It's great. I think, you know, I'm still collecting questions in the chat. Is there a specific example that you're excited about right now? And afterwards, maybe Jeff and Brian, if you want to take a stab at that question as well, that would be great.
An example of coordination?
Like an example of a technology that's already doing that? Like, is there a project out there? Because we always talk about, okay, what is a use case right now of currently existing technology? So is there a project that's actively working toward this?
I mean, there is like at the European level, there is like a little bit of like some institutional attempt at actually creating like a blockchain partnership where different institutions will be using the same technology in order to coordinate themselves. So it's more on the regional level. I don't know of any project. I mean, I think it's way too early anyhow to get this at the international level, but I think it's, you know, as private and public institutions start adopting the technology, then it becomes easier to somehow connect. Yeah, I think we are still very far from seeing a real blockchain consortium that is extending beyond small private companies or basically like public proof of concepts.
All right. I think that you've posted a lot about interoperability as well, and maybe I can share some links if I find them. But for now, I want to give it to Jeff as well to answer the question. Basically, yeah.
Yeah. So
should I repeat?
Yeah, can you repeat the question? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So, are there any coordination problems on a global level, you know, that are civilization-wide important that technology could actually help with? Especially, like, let's say, decentralized coordination technologies.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that doesn't always seem to us to be like a technology, but kind of is sort of the ways in which we are using the internet for sort of distributed global sense making, and like the way that you can use everything from like Reddit to Twitter to a lot of these platforms to share research really quickly. And the way that preprint servers have just like enabled us to get scientific information so fast, basically do peer review without having to wait 2 months for that process. So I think that that's actually a real form of global coordination that is probably moving the dial the most on fighting this virus right now, because, you know, I can just like I have like a paper on my desk that's like specifically about tracking mutations in SARS-CoV-2 and looking at evidence of functional evolution in new mutations. And I'm just like, you know, I didn't have to wait 2 months for that. I just like, I instantly got that because I went to a preprint server and looked that up. And I can also go to Twitter and see who's talking about it. And I can like look at virologists who are commenting on that. And that's such a new capability. And it's so fast, and it's so, I think in some ways it's so effective, because it can you can get that information to everyone who needs to see it just really fast. Now there's downsides too, right? Like, you know, also you amplify conspiracy theories extremely quickly. But I do think that on the side of like the edge of sense making, we've just sped that up so much, and that's like a huge win for global coordination.
All right, thank you so much, Brian.
Yeah, so, you know, on a more mundane kind of topic than contact tracing or immunity credentials, there's already been deployment of supply chain traceability tools in this space. There's a blockchain network called Trust Your Supplier that's been around actually for about a year in production, with a couple of 100 suppliers and thousands of buyers on it, that has now turned on kind of support, if you will, for PPEs and masks and that sort of thing. Because there's been a horrible problem where fly-by-night operators have been landing these tens of millions of dollars contracts with states and federal buyers and others trying to buy large amounts, who basically then disappear with the money or never deliver. And so as a way to verify, you know, who am I doing business with? Have they actually delivered successfully in the past? These kinds of tools are being used today to try to answer that. And then secondly, you know, on the contact tracing and exposure notification stuff, there are open source projects that are viable. And I still want to emphasize, it's not just blockchain technology, it's open source technology that I think is essential to building public trust and confidence in these solutions. So I want to highlight the Safe Paths initiative, which MIT has been around. And there's another MIT project called PACT, which is interesting. There's another one called nexttrace.org. These are volunteer organizations that build upon upon some of the recommendations coming out of PEPP and D3PT, like were mentioned, but are actually building shipping software. Now, I actually think they all started with the GPS and Wi-Fi as like the way of trying to connect people and figure out who's been close to who, all of which are highly problematic, even with ways of doing zero knowledge proofs and stuff. I really do want to say the Google Apple exposure notification APIs, I think, are the beginnings of striking the right balance. And they don't create centralized repositories of where people have been or where you've seen. And they do leave consent and agency in the hands of the individuals to decide, okay, do I want to have the positive test? Do I share that upstream? I've been notified, I've been close to somebody with a positive test. Do I now willingly talk to a public health authority to get tracked, and do I lock down for 14 days or do something else? And that's the right balance to be struck. But there's a lot more to take those kinds of things forward. But I'm already encouraged by what I'm seeing happening out there.
Thank you.
Just to jump in on what Brian said.
Yes, jump in.
So the TCN Coalition is the sort of open source effort in the US and sort of North America, working on decentralized contact tracing protocols. Also going to, working with the Google and Apple APIs, and then DP3T, I think, is the European one. I think both of these were actually used as inspiration for Google and Apple's protocol. So I think this is actually a real success story for open source, like you're mentioning, Brian, because it was open source movements that developed these things in the first place, and Google and Apple said, hey, that's a good idea. We should actually make this possible at the hardware level, and so at the firmware level. So I think it's just like useful to track that credit in terms of how that story actually unfolded, because I think people are like, oh, Google and Apple did this, and yeah, they did, but they did it actually taking direct inspiration, sort of direct protocol design from these open source movements.
And in fact, they had to, because you needed access to Bluetooth Low Energy in the background, which for good reason, they did not want to allow to any app developer, right, except those who really were building the right kinds of apps. And so for good reason, they kind of said to do that, we're going to place a high bar, a bar that'll probably rise. They've already talked about only allowing one app per jurisdiction to be able to have access to those APIs. And that's good from a privacy point of view. Those are APIs that would become surveillance nightmares if they were used the wrong way.
All right,
There was
thank you.
something
Maybe
else in Brian's
Yeah.
Brian's points that I wanted to add to, which is the point about supply chains is very interesting. Supply chains are certainly one potential area where there's a lot of coordination that already happens, right? We already have a global network of objects that move around and services that move around, and at least one coordinated number, somewhat coordinated number, which is the price of those objects. Sometimes it's kind of a standardized price that you can see. There are a lot of things we would probably like to have threaded through our supply chains, in addition to that basic price number. One Brian was talking about is trustworthiness and sort of certification of the product. Can you tell that a mask that you order from a particular supplier in another country is going to be the kind of mask you expect? That's a very hard property to ensure, of course, because there's a lot of game theory and weirdness involved in those transactions, especially in a crisis. But there are lots of other things we would really love to be able to track through our supply chains. Embodied carbon is an obvious one. And lots of other environmental and safety properties of the objects that we exchange. Labor practices would be really interesting if there was a way that you could tell that two objects you could buy had different labor standards. Then it would be much easier either for consumers or for governments to take action to protect against really exploitative labor conditions. And it's also, unfortunately, sort of really hard to just add this kind of data, both because you have to go to lots of institutions around the world that are currently doing things differently and kind of get them to add this new information. And then you have an incentives problem along the way, which is everyone wants to look good and not necessarily do the thing that they're supposed to have done in all cases. And so I think there's like a huge unsolved and interesting bundle of problems about how we retrofit information into supply chains, whether it's possible, whether we should be trying to do that at a global scale.
Oh, interesting. Okay, we're now at 2 minutes over time. I just want to give all panelists who have to go the opportunity to hop off. and want to give you all, while you're still on, my great heartfelt thank you for getting up at 4 a.m. in Australia and for making time, from across the board, from I think Europe, Australia, and Northern America. I think thank you so much for joining today and giving us this kind of like bird's eye view on like what current efforts are and where we may be headed. That said, I'm going to wave goodbye now to the ones that have to leave and follow up with your follow-ups for participants. If anyone is interested to stay, you're very welcome to stay. Maybe we can do, for those who are staying, if anyone's staying, maybe another 5 minutes or 10 on Q&A, and then we're going to be moving into participant sharing. I'm just collecting more and more questions here in the chat. I think now people are coming to the end of it. I think Creon had a question. Creon, I'm going to unmute you, and if I'm missing anything, then please let me know. Creon. Great, you are now. Oh, you are. Have you already unmuted you? Okay, here we go.
Thanks, Allison. I have been bantering with Brian about this on the chat, but I'm curious if the panelists, including Brian, might want to just state a few visions of their end game for these contact tracing and testing based approaches to solving the COVID-19 problem. Like, when do you know? Like, do you ever stop? And if so, under what conditions? And a related question is, which I asked earlier, and please feel free to answer one or both, is how do we these contact tracing and testing mass approaches, even if you ignore some of the privacy and other problems, they are resource intensive, and you always have to look at, deploying resources towards that versus deploying resources perhaps towards some other mitigations. And I'm wondering how we kind of take the bigger picture and look at, even if it's not so much of where's the end game, it's like, well, where is it the point of diminishing returns?
Right, and I'll jump in. I know others have answers to this, but I think we need the R value, right, to be below 1. We need this to be just to be manageable. I had also said R less than 1 until virus equals 0, recognizing that globally speaking, it might be impossible to get virus equals 0, and you might not need to once a vaccine emerges. But recognize it's going to take a while, not just to manufacture the vaccine, but to get them actually deployed widely enough to get to herd immunity, a period of time of 2 years. Right. So in order to be able to open up different geographies, different areas where the virus has come under control, and to address the incredible economic issues that have emerged, being able to do contact tracing as a way of reducing the risk of super spreader events, of other types of catastrophic kinds of re-flourishings of this virus. And so I think it has to be a key part, even if you recognize ultimately this is endemic, which I think it is. Contact tracing still has a huge role to play in reducing or eliminating unnecessary deaths and getting us out of our houses again.
Brian, may I push back on that for just 2 quick seconds? One is, I'd like to point out that vaccine is not 2 years. Vaccine is 2 years to never. We're not sure when. And then the other, and so we have to think about.
Further to my point. Further to my point.
Right. And then the other thing I'd kind of wonder is, at what point does enough of the herd, at what point do we say, we throw up our hands and say, look, X% of the people have this thing, contact tracing just is not going to put it back in the bottle. Do you think there's such a number, or do you think like even if 50% or 80% of the people are positive, we should still contact trace?
That gets into the how many deaths are acceptable thing, which puts it in the category of flu deaths or deaths by gun violence or other things. And that's beyond, above my pay grade.
It's also the case that we don't know about the long-term immunity, right? So we actually don't know if you get 80% of the population, will you actually have herd immunity, or will you, if you have the high potential reinfection, if memory T cells don't actually stay around that long, you may be looking at seasonal reoccurring infections. We just don't know that yet. So
which you can say with any virus, and which is highly speculable and even withdrawn by the Koreans who initially proposed that problem in the first place. But you're right in principle.
So I think part of what we're doing still is buying more time, right? I think we're really trying to keep infections as low as possible while we work on treatments. I think really getting really effective treatments would go a long way towards making this thing less bad. Obviously working on vaccines, but there's no guarantee that will work, and we don't know how effective that will be. I also think we still need to think about keeping hospitals from getting overwhelmed. Even if we continue to have thousands or over 1,000 infections per day, that can be sort of sustainable without overloading hospitals for a while. If that number gets a lot higher, then we'll see New York-like situations or Italy-like situations again, and that's what I think we really need to avoid. So I think actually when you do the economics of how much massive testing and contact tracing costs, it still ends up being a lot cheaper than the medical bills you'd pay from overloading those hospitals.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer is going to be probably quite different in different parts of the world. So if you look at this kind of lockdown, and then should you end your lockdown, and like should you prioritize your resources at the end of that? The optimal answer or the plausible answers, I think, are really different in different places. In the United States, if you look at the United States as a whole, there really isn't. It doesn't look very likely that there's a pathway that doesn't lead to herd immunity relatively quickly in the United States as a whole, which unfortunately means that lots more places, including New York, is going to look like New York for like 3 times longer, because only 21% of New York City is seropositive as of a week or two ago, and so in order to get to herd immunity, you need to do that 2 or 3 times. But the combination of prevalence across the United States and the failure of political coordination and institutional response at a federal level, and the fact that this really widespread conspiracy theory driven response in US policy in a lot of places, I think means that for the United States, only certain regions might be able to exclude themselves, but the country as a whole is going to have some path to herd immunity. If you look at other countries that have really succeeded in squashing their curves, some of those regions within those countries might actually be able to go all the way to elimination. So there are 2 states in a territory within Australia right now that have not had cases for extended periods of time. So Western Australia, South Australia, and the Northern Territory have pulled that off thus far. And Western Australia has created a hard border between itself and the rest of the country, and is apparently planning a strategy of just being really hard to visit and killing its tourism industry, and really hoping that there's a vaccine. If you play Western Australia's strategy and you get 2 to 3 years in to the COVID-19 era, and there isn't either a really good treatment or a vaccine, you're going to really be regretting having cut yourself off from the world for a long period of time, and then facing this like awful moment when you're going to rejoin the world and your population is going to get hit with a big wave of COVID-19. But if a vaccine becomes available, you're going to be really glad that you followed that path. Then the last thing I'm just going to say and finish is that there are some places that are in between, where they may be able to hold prevalence at really low levels and get through for a long period of time with some hybrid strategy.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Robin posted a good post on that. Primavera, do you want to tackle that question? And then we have Jim with the final question.
Yeah, I actually have I think a controversial answer, which I will be curious to know what the other people think about. But to me, my vision is that it really depends on the effectiveness of the app, and the effectiveness of the app depends on the perspective of who is the app intended to serve. And I think there is a lot of criticism today about those contact tracing apps, which are actually not serving the interest of the individuals, either because it goes against their privacy or because there is just limitation to Bluetooth and there is a lot of false positive or negatives. But if we instead look at the app not really serving the interest of the individuals, but actually serving the interest of the community more generally, to some extent, it's okay actually to have false negative to the extent that is actually minimize the contamination rate and enable some people to start going outside and reenacting the economy. But basically, so to me, the thing that I consider myself to be controversial, but that I'm thinking a lot about, is that I think maybe instead of trying to me, like the big danger is not when do we stop doing contact tracing, is to which extent the measure that we will have introduced in order to do contact tracing will continue even after this crisis could be that. And I think we've seen this with like 9/11 and like all these kind of surveillance measures that are instantiated because of a particular crisis, and then they continue. And so to me, it seems that perhaps, and I think South Korea is a good example of that, it might actually be better, and that's controversial, to actually just forget about privacy for a while and create a state of exception and actually implement specific measures that are collecting data from all the places and that are really like acting very harshly on trying to minimize this contamination rate. And then once the state of exception is over, then eliminating all those measures, right? As opposed to trying to create these solutions which is sufficiently privacy compliant and therefore it's not scary enough, and therefore we might actually keep it forever. And you know, maybe insurance companies will decide, well, you actually need to have your app in order to get your insurance, and maybe employers will also do that. So to me, there is like a danger about, by the design of the app is such that it might be more or less acceptable, and perhaps it's better to have something that is not acceptable during a moment of crisis, so that once the crisis is over, we stop immediately with this measure as opposed to maintaining it over time.
I would love to hear maybe other people's opinions on like the ability to stop afterwards, and maybe we're too far down the road there. But I would love to hear it from Jim first, who has been asking on Slack for a while. So Jim, I'm going to unmute you, and then maybe participants can take both of them.
Oh, thanks. So Peter had a really beautiful metaphor a few minutes ago about a global immune system that has risen up to respond to this pandemic. It's probably a adaptive immune system more than an innate immune system because it's very new. And in a lot of places, it's consisted mostly of high agency individuals and networks and not so much governments. And that sort of dynamic might well continue. So I think it's time to lay out what a libertarian immune system would look like. And so I'll suggest what it might look like. Property owners, especially businesses, may decide to only let people on their premises, both employees and customers, if they have proof of being tested. So this is a completely decentralized solution. No monopoly on who the tests are made by or given by. No monopoly on decisions. This doesn't even really require contact tracing, although I support that as a separate measure. And as Brian was discussing earlier, it can be done without a link to names or identities. So that would provide a lot of safe spaces. Homes could also do this as well. And then probably some fraction of businesses would see a market opportunity to open themselves only to people who are infected, both workers and customers. That would provide the kind of temporary separation that we all need to contain the virus. It would allow economic activity to resume robustly. And it would do it in a very privacy protecting because decentralized way.
All right, is that a question? Do you want to just get panelists' comments on that?
Well, my question basically is there any reason why people should not be pushing forward with that?
Okay, let's make it the final words from the panel as well. So if you guys want to close it out with answering to that question and wrapping it up, that would be amazing. Thank you. Let's hear it. Who wants to go first? Hands up if anyone wants immediately, otherwise I'll pick on people. Brian, do you want to
I'll
go first?
Going first. It is why I think these issues of contact tracing and immunity credentials are linked, as they do tug at the questions of agency versus self-determination and big philosophical issues and moral issues for us to weigh. So I'm really happy to see people out there, lots of different institutions and individuals weighing on these moral issues. And it is one reason I think immunity credentials, as controversial as they are, is something that we're going to have to live with, and a harm reduction approach is going to have to be taken to that to figure out how to end up in the best possible spot in terms of protecting privacy. That's at least motivated my work in this space, and really glad to see it front of center for a lot of other technologists out there.
I think there's a reasonably high chance that we're really going to need immunity credentials in a lot of places, and that they'll be essential enough that they will happen. The civil liberties questions around them are really like fraught and thorny. There's a little bit in the Safra Center report on some issues around them, like ensuring that if you've got a credential based on antibody testing, that for essentially all purposes, like a recent fresh PCR test should be just as good, so you don't create incentives for people to give themselves COVID-19 in order to get the credential. But I think we're going to have to work through those like thorny questions really fast. The other reaction I have to Jim is I find the libertarian perspective on these questions really interesting. As a non-libertarian, it seems to me that, you know, pandemics really challenge the individual like freedom perspective quite profoundly. It's, you know, someone a month or two ago can do something that significantly affects your rights and liberties right now, and so seeing the proposals from my libertarian friends on, you know, how do you grapple with those really severe externalities is very interesting.
All right, thank you so much, Primavera.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a matter of like, how do you ensure that this libertarian world actually recognize equity, and how do you make sure that we do have enough facilities to provide testing to everyone, and that it's not just people that can afford being tested to prove that they are immune, that they get this passport, and everyone else just stays locked in. Same thing, like how do you actually ensure that when people get tested and are not immune, we provide nonetheless the necessary, so it's the exact opposite of a libertarian model, but it's more of a communitarian model. Like, of course, we want and we need those kind of immunity passports, but only the immunity passports are not solving the problem. The problem is a much broader institutional problem, and we need to set up all the necessary institutions in order to ensure that there is not just a small chunk of the population that actually can benefit from those.
Sweet. Okay, Jeff, what are your final words?
I think when it comes to talks about immunity certification, you do have this sort of very thorny problem around centralization, which is very hard to get away from centralization. So in the case of an antibody test, you know, most antibody tests on the market right now have a fairly insufficiently high specificity, which means that the number of false positives are going to be as high or higher than the number of true positives. So just because your antibody test says you're immune doesn't mean that you're immune. In fact, it means you might flip a coin and you might be immune, which is like obviously not good enough right now for immunity certificates. You know, certified 50% chance that you're immune. Like it's a problem. I mean, that can be useful, but it's not going to do what people want it to do. Now, some of those tests are much more accurate, and they will get more accurate. So it will be possible to say, you know, we can certify you so long as you use this kind of test. But that's where it becomes tricky to do from a decentralized way, because who's assessing the validity of the test, and how do you trust that the test is actually accurate?
Oh man, okay, lots of questions, I think, and I really like the I don't know, I think the very the diverse ways of viewpoints that were politically inspired, but I think are still quite actionable from a perspective in which multiple people with different political views should be able to get excited about those. So I think, you know, that was a really nice way to close it out. thank you so much for all of you to join. I do want to, given the fact that we probably have a few folks on the salon today that are holding cryptocurrencies, please, if you're interested, Foresight is accepting cryptocurrency donations. In fact, that was a bigger part of our donations last year. I just posted 2 links. One is the donation link, and the second link is for membership benefits at different levels. Please look at both of those. We currently accept Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, and Zcash. But if you want to donate other cryptocurrencies, we can definitely talk about it. I would be super grateful to get your support. Thank you so much to all panelists for joining today. I thought this was a tremendous discussion. This is definitely the salon in which we've stayed most over time. I'm hoping that next time I'll find a way in which I can channel questions quicker. But I think it was super worth it. And thanks for making it so juicy, really to the end of it. I think you're leaving participants with a lot of things to follow up on. I'm going to follow up with an email later today. Please, to all panelists, send me individual items that you want to highlight. And we discussed the Harvard report a little bit. It came up a few times. I linked it to the collaborative Google Doc. So please feel free to add your notes there. Thank you. I really appreciate you all from joining everywhere. And I want to say goodbye to all of you now. And I'm going to hand it over to Lou for the last 7 minutes of a more participant-focused check-in. So thank you so much for me. I really, really appreciate you showing up today for so long. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you again. Thank you, Alison. This was such a great discussion and super interesting. And it was great to see how everyone was so engaged. Since we only have 7 minutes for this moment of sharing, let's just do it on this session. And I think, usually we use this time in order to connect or share things that are more personal. But I guess since there was so much engagement on this topic, I think my question for you today would be, what did this session brought up for you? And usually I have like prompts for self-reflection. I think 2 that could be interesting are usually what are prompts 8 and 9, or that I'm posting in the chat right now. Do you have any fears about emerging from this shelter in place? And what are things, some things changing to life that will make you feel actively excited? I guess, we could frame it along this question of what about change of civil rights, liberties, and potential threats to them. If anyone has a contribution, you can raise your hand, and I will unmute you or maybe post in the chat. So did this session bring anything up for you in particular? 5 minutes.
We have one hand raised for Mark Stowe. I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, so what I'm not hearing a lot about, and I might have missed earlier time, is these proposals to use what people are calling far UVC light as a way to sterilize public places without exposing people to harmful UV, because it's so UVC at the far ends do not penetrate, and they will kill surface bacteria and viruses, but leave skin alone. So what I could imagine is a future where people basically replace light bulbs in all public places, which are expensive, but all these solutions are going to be expensive. And you could have on top of that infrared sensors that are taking people's temperatures as they come in. So basically you could get R below 1 by technological solutions, and then minimize the amount of contact tracing and so forth that you have to do on top of that. So, I mean, basically, I think hybrid solutions are likely, even, and may actually come sooner than a vaccine.
Okay, and they say, is that the robots that disinfect with light that is also mentioned in the chat? Is that like related?
Yeah, there are several companies who are building those now, and I'm sure there'll be more. The light is good. The other technology which has just come out, which is I think the most important one, is quick testing. There's some new tests that can detect the virus within a day of infection. And if you can do that, you have a very short time of infectious breeding, and you just test everyone every day. And you may say that's really expensive, but it's a lot cheaper than the alternatives.
Any idea on the estimation of cost, like how much it would cost to be able to test everyone, like mostly every day?
Well, it costs very little if you get the presence of the virus very low, because you can do something called group testing, where you get 128 people together and you mix all of their fluids together, and then you test that mix of fluids. And as long as the proximity is low, most of those are negative, and you say, okay, all 128 of you are clear, depending on your false negative rate. And so you can basically, the lower the prevalence of the virus, the cheaper it gets. It's actually got inherently a linear cost once you're successful with it.
Interesting, which segues a bit in our bit of hope theme. So thank you for that, Brad. And I guess I'll take the last contribution from Paul, and I'll unmute you. And after that, we'll probably close.
Okay. My understanding is the adaptability to any technology is based on how easy it is to utilize. If we had something like a toothbrush test, people tend to brush their teeth daily or several times a day. If a test was universally integrated with a normally utilized practice like brushing our teeth, it may be adaptable on a global scale very quickly.
Okay, well, testing toothbrush, maybe that's our next bit of hope. All right, I don't see necessarily any like other hand raised, and it's now 12:29, so it was a short...
I had one issue, by the way, that wasn't discussed. Bruce Schneier, who's also on the EFF board, he has actually written an essay saying that he's surprised everyone's into contact tracing because he thinks it's entirely ineffective. Now, I don't actually agree with his essay, but I'm curious if any of the panelists had a view about this counter to it, saying that you know, why that human contact tracing, Bruce argues, is very effective, but digital contact tracing is not going to really add much efficacy to it. Is what, if you've read Bruce's essay, you know what he said.
Cool, and this will be the word of the end. I'll say goodbye to you all, everyone. Thank you so much for being so engaged in this session. I can't wait to see you tomorrow for our last panel of the week, and we will send you, of course, as usual, some follow-up to this session and preparation for the session tomorrow, which I also really look forward to. So thank you so much for sticking all the way to the end, and see you tomorrow, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.
So Alison, if you and Lou are still there for another minute, just check back on some of my comments, direct message. Bye.
I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I have to hop on in a different call. I'm really sorry. But we can talk on Slack, okay?
Yeah, I did.
And I think Prima should do some salons as well. She did great ones in San Francisco, so we should get her organizing some things.
Oh my God, I once went to her to a salon by her, and it was utterly amazing. It was totally amazing. Yes, I would love to.
I think the sun set in France, so she slowly faded away.
Yeah, it was nice though. Okay, so much for anonymity. All right, bye guys.